Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. COVID policies or climate policies. No matter what they are, you're not allowed to question either, even though the math is pretty fuzzy on both, and most COVID and climate policies rely on computer simulations called models. Today, if you question climate policies, you're called a climate denier. As of this week, if you question COVID policies, you're called a white supremacist. Effectively, politicians like Premier Kenney, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, and Mayor Naheed Nenshi of Calgary are calling you people who protest or question COVID policies neo-Nazis.
Those people at those anti-mask protests, let's not kid ourselves, they're not people who need to eat. They are people who are marching in thinly veiled white nationalist, supremacist, anti-government protests, and they don't deserve that kind of sympathy.
They refer to the use of those Tiki torches in marches and images of Charlottesville on posters as evidence that those who protest are neo-Nazis. But torches have always been part of angry public protests, even on The Simpsons. They fail to understand or want to mislead you on American civil liberties. Note that the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, went to court to defend the right of those protesters in Charlottesville who were marching in favor of protecting the statue of Robert E. Lee and history. The ACLU also defended the right of neo-Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois in 1978. Despite that place being home to many Holocaust survivors. Note that for the past 12 years, the president of the ACLU was Susan Herman, a Jewish constitutional lawyer. So the point is that freedom of speech and the right to protest is integral also to Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And if you want to disagree with the protesters' point of view, please do so, but don't denigrate and bully them. That's what's been going on in the world of climate science for 40 years, and that's partly why many people are afraid to question COVID policies. But a healthy democracy relies on open, civil debate for the best balance on policy issues. So let's talk about the source of lockdown demands. The original lockdown alarm came from a fellow named Neil Ferguson, now known as Professor Lockdown. But despite almost all governments accepting his modeled results of potential deaths and infections spread due to COVID, it turns out that Professor Lockdown has no experience in biological epidemiology whatsoever. He's a theoretical physicist, and he even admitted on BBC that he does not even have a high school level of biology, nor is he trained in computer modeling. He's made numerous wildly incorrect modeled projections in the past that cost the UK billions of dollars. And interestingly enough, from our perspective, his girlfriend is a climate activist. I doubt that many of those white supremacist lockdown protesters in the streets of Canada, many of whom are not white, are aware of this information per se, but they are aware that democracy is dying due to this pandemic, and that's why they're in the streets. They're protesting the lockdowns, which do not account for the other societal losses over COVID deaths. That is, the unaccounted losses that are part of the flawed COVID models, according to a recent study by Professor Douglas Allen of Simon Fraser University. He points out the destruction of the economy and the many more people who are also dying due to lockdowns. Allen studied 80 papers on the models that drove lockdown policy. The models are based on assumptions made by the person entering the data, and you've all heard of garbage in, garbage out. Well, that's what can happen with computer-simulated models. So Professor Allen found that the models typically and simplistically assumed an exponential growth of cases of infection day after day. Professor Allen points out that some early models used what's called a value of statistical life, VSL, a method that is a dollar measure of the utility an individual receives from living. Now, that sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? But this type of assessment was similarly used as the cost-benefit rationale for coal phase-out health modeling in Ontario and also in Alberta. It sounds rather crude to assign a monetary value to life, but let's look at how it works. I'm quoting from the Allen paper. The VSL is estimated by observing individual marginal trade-offs. Thus, if we observe someone willing to pay $1,000 to reduce the chance of death by 1 in 10,000 over the next year, then this would imply a value of life of $10 million. But the problem with this is that this assigns a $10 million value to each life, whether you're 7 years old or 70 years old. In terms of society, when you're 7 years old, you have an entire life ahead of you to be part of society and contribute in many ways. If you're a working 45-year-old person, then you have important financial and energetic contributions to make to society that a person of 70 or 80 no longer can make. And if you're 70 or 80, your life expectancy is perhaps 10 or 20 years. If you're in declining health, you might not feel like your life is worth $10 million, even if you love life, and even if your family loves you. The point is that this is a false assumption to apply the same value to all persons of all ages, because the outcome is skewed and leaves out the most important values. Professor Allen writes, to take the extreme case, if this particular model estimate implies that 200,000 Canadians would die from COVID-19 without lockdown, and each life lost was worth $10 million, then the benefit of lockdown would be $1 trillion. So in 2018, Canada's GDP was just $2.1 trillion, and therefore that seems to justify the lockdowns. But Professor Allen goes on to point out the following. This type of comparison, however, is entirely inappropriate because this statistical model is based on the utility of life, and therefore the costs of lockdown must also be based on the lost utility of lockdown. It's been understood from the very beginning of the pandemic that lockdown caused a broad range of costs through lost civil liberty, lost social contact, lost educational opportunities, lost medical preventions and procedures, and increased domestic violence, increased anxiety and mental suffering, and increased deaths of despair. If the value of lockdown is measured in utility, then the costs of lockdown must be measured in the same fashion. Excluding the value of lost non-market goods, like goods not measured by the GDP, grossly underestimates the cost of lockdown. In fact, he said it properly calculated, the losses are over $1 trillion. The losses. So these are the things that the lockdown protesters are championing in the face of these draconian measures that are based on poorly thought out public policy. They're protesting because they've got losses of jobs, work, civil liberties, education. They have anxiety, mental suffering, deaths of despair. They have losses in medical prevention and canceled surgeries for non-COVID issues. And now they're being treated like cattle and denigrated as neo-Nazis by elected officials who've not lost a single day of work or any pay. And it's all based on these faulty models. As summarized in the Epoch Times, Allen's own cost-benefit analysis is based on the calculation of life years saved, which determines how many years of lost life will have been caused by the various harms of lockdown versus how many years of lost life were saved by lockdowns. Based on his lost life calculation, lockdown measures have caused 282 times more harm than benefit to Canadian society over the long term, or 282 times more life years lost than saved. And if we look at climate models for comparison, as Dr. John Christie has shown, climate models overpredict global warming trends by many factors, with the Canadian climate model, worst of all, projecting more than 3 times the warming observed temperatures. But climate policies are being set based on these wildly exaggerated computer simulations, not reality. Roger Pielke Jr. wrote about the unstoppable momentum of outdated science, showing how climate scientists have accepted poor or outdated climate assumptions and then done new research and issued new policy recommendations based on modeled inputs that are completely wrong. It seems a similar phenomenon has happened with COVID modeling. The public sense this, and so they protest. Now, you would think that with the revelations of problems in climate models and COVID models, there would be a change, of course, in public policy. After all, governments keep claiming that they rely on the best scientific evidence. But psychologist Leon Festinger and colleagues found an interesting phenomenon some years ago, in which he and his colleagues wrote about in the book, When Prophecy Fails. Festinger and his team of social psychologists found that when people firmly hold strong beliefs, even when there's evidence that should normally cause a person to change their mind, they tend to grip even more firmly to that failed prophecy, especially if they're part of a group like, let's say, politicians, climate activists. And likewise, as we often see in the world of investment, when there's a lot of money and effort already into an idea, a project, or a company, investors and promoters often hang on to the bitter end, even when it's clear that the project is a no-go. That's just human nature. So it's time for open civil debate on the reckless policies on COVID lockdowns and the alleged climate emergency, which are both based on poorly designed models, which are both destroying society and, more importantly, destroying individual people's lives and the very tenets of democracy. And it's important that we have this debate now, because climate activists are threatening climate lockdowns as a way of stopping climate change. Again, a premise reliant on faulty computer models and faulty climate emergency claims. So it's time we stop demonizing each other for holding dissenting views on COVID or climate. It's time we started having what Minister Wilkinson has called for, an adult debate. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.